We're back in session. This is the time and place for an update on the Watercourse Cannabis Cultivation Regulatory Program. This is an information item only, and no action will be taken. All those board meetings provide direction to staff. We'll now begin with the staff presentation. Following the staff presentation, interested persons will be allowed 3 minutes each to address the board, and a timer will be used with the stipulation I previously have with the executive officer. So we're ready to begin.
Thank you. Good morning or early afternoon, Dr. Longley, members of the board. Thank you for having us here. As you mentioned, I'm Griffin Perea. I'm the program manager for the cannabis program in the Central Valley region. And with me is Elizabeth Betancourt, a senior in the Reading office overseeing the permitting unit. And we'll be giving an update on the Central Valley Board's cannabis program, including permitting information as well as some of our enforcement activities. So, throughout the presentation, I will start by giving a very brief background, both legislative background as well as the Central Valley Board's initial involvement in cannabis regulation, as well as some of the activities that we've completed in the last fiscal year, 17-18, as well as what we're going to be working on throughout this fiscal year. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll be discussing some of the challenges that the program has faced and continues to face in implementing the regulations. All right, so starting with a very brief legislative background. Prior to 1996, cultivation within the state of California was completely illegal. 1996 was the passage of the first kind of attempt at regulating cultivation for medicinal cannabis purposes. And so prior to that time frame, everything, like I mentioned, was illegal. A lot of the cartel-style grows on federal lands as well as state lands. And these are just some of the photos of those types of grows that have been documented on state and federal lands. So moving forward to 2003 was a kind of an update to what was passed in 1996. It really started the coalition-style approach to cultivation, established some of the medical guidance requirements as well as doctors' requirements for medicinal cannabis consumption. And then there was a decent time of stasis between 2003 and 2015, which was really the catalyst for what we see today. Starting in 2015, several bills went through the legislative process that kicked off the commercial medical cultivation regulation statewide. Following on that, in 2016 was Proposition 64, which added the additional recreational cultivation, both commercial and personal use. And then since that time, basically every year there has been legislative updates. That in 2016, Senate Bill 837, which is what got the State Water Board involved in adopting statewide policy requirements as well as statewide general order and water quality requirements. And then 2017 really just served to combine the commercial medicinal cultivation regulations with the commercial recreational cultivation requirements, so that there's one comprehensive set of statewide regulations governing both recreational and commercial cultivation, sales, distribution, and consumption. Oh, I was supposed to put that earlier. Sorry. Okay, and so the Central Valley Board, if you believe Central Valley Board legend and lore, way back in 2014, a very motivated assistant executive officer in the Reading office decided it would be fun and exciting to start regulating cannabis cultivation. So 2014, we, along with the North Coast Regional Board, really started getting the pieces together in the form of a pilot program. And most of the pilot program was really identifying what the key environmental issues are and developing ways to deal with those. And so the first set of regulations within the Central Valley region was in October 2015, the passage of the Central Valley Board's General Order for Waste Discharges. And then moving from then until now, there's been a rapid rate of expansion in the program. So within the Central Valley region, we've gone from 4 staff in late 2014 to 15 and a half staff this last fiscal year. And so with that, we've had the statewide programmatic expansion in 2017 as well, which we'll be discussing in more detail in a few slides. So with the Central Valley Board's expansion and additional staffing resources, we do now have 2 units within the Reading office, 1 unit dedicated to enforcement, 1 unit dedicated to permitting and compliance. And then we have a unit in the Rancho Cordova office with staff dedicated to enforcement activities and staff dedicated to permitting and compliant activities. But we do not have staff in the Fresno office as of yet. And so what we've done to better balance the workload and the amount of area covered by both offices is we've revised the traditional boundaries between the Fresno and the Rancho Cordova office and the Reading and the Rancho Cordova office. And the new boundaries for the cannabis program basically split the region right in half. So there's equal counties, equal workload associated with both offices.
Could I ask why we don't have anybody in the Fresno office?
Yeah, absolutely. When we were initially getting involved in the program, most of the impacts noted were in the northern portion of the state. However, since some of the legalization and some of the counties that have come online for commercial style cultivation, it has come down further south, but the majority of the water quality impacts that we're seeing are still focused in that kind of central portion of the state and moving north. However, we are becoming much more involved in the southern portion of the state. We have recently been doing some inspections in Madera County and starting to work with those jurisdictions so that we can still have a presence down towards the Fresno territory with our Rancho Cordova staff. Okay, so now I'm going to kick it over to Elizabeth. She's going to be describing the statewide expansion as well as some of the permitting and compliance activities that have been going on within the Central Valley region.
Sorry, a quick change here. So in October 2017, our statewide general order and policy were adopted. As Griffin mentioned, we began those in 2016 with the passage of SB 837 in the legislature. The Proposition 64 passed by the voters in 2016 was what gave us more firm deadlines to get that passed. This added positions to the state board as well as to our regional board. And CDFW got a significant additional number of positions as well. And all of these are split between enforcement, permitting, with the state board, and of course is water rights as well. We have started roundtable meetings, as I believe most programs in the water board have. These initially occurred monthly and now occur every 2 months. And our roundtable meetings include all of the senior environmental scientists, senior engineering geologists, and senior engineers that are part of the cannabis program, as well as some of our executive management. These have helped us to maintain coordination. I think we've started off pretty well and continue to do better at coordinating between divisions and units. It's improved our consistency in how we apply the general order throughout the state. And we have started in developing statewide processes and policies. Of course, the order is applied by regional staff, but doing kind of more statewide application has allowed us to be a little bit more consistent and efficient with our time as well. We do have an online application process, and we have a snapshot of that in a future slide, but the online application process has allowed us to be much more streamlined in how we process the applications, and it's really cut down on staff time. The process requires a self-certification by the cultivators, by the enrollees. So we have some questions occasionally, but generally speaking, we process that application as soon as they pay for their notice of applicability, that fee, and then they receive that in the mail, and from that point on, they are enrolled and are eligible to be inspected. We call them fairly often for their reports, and just stay in touch with them in that way. We're also working on coordination with state licensing agencies. In fact, in the next 2 weeks, there are a few webinars available to staff that CDFA is putting on, so that staff can better understand the sort of larger state process that happens through the Department of Agriculture. So with our regulations, Griffin mentioned in the past, before cultivation was legal on a broader scale, this is a lot of what we'd see. These cases are from the last couple of years. Some of them probably should look familiar to you as they came to you as enforcement cases. We have pesticides, herbicides, chemicals in general being stored improperly, and definitely in close proximity to waterways that could threaten species, could threaten humans, drinking water sources. We have really unfortunate incarnation of a water storage facility in the upper right here. People will put tarps in rivers to hold back water and from there pipe it to their cultivation site. And then of course the one on the left and the lower photo there are examples of extreme sedimentation, erosional risk and occurrence. So with regulation, we go from this to a much more, this probably looks more familiar as conventional agriculture. We hope that those who are regulated in our order will become more like conventional agriculture. And I will add to what we've seen today. These are sites that the permitting and compliance staff has inspected. All of these photos happen to be from Yolo County. I'll be talking a little bit more about Yolo County in the next few slides, but yeah, it's regulated. We see it regularly. The local jurisdiction knows the cultivators. They're applying pesticides or fertilizers at agronomic rates. We don't have the danger of runoff, hopefully, that we see in the illegal sites.
All right, so now we're going to get into the accomplishments and progress we've made over the last fiscal year. One of the biggest things that we encountered over the last fiscal year was the hiring and training. We did get quite a few additional resources, quite a few different staff positions, and going through the hiring and training process was definitely time-consuming. There is a pretty high standard of training for folks in the cannabis program. They have to do a little bit higher level of hazard identification training, especially for some of the enforcement sites that we deal with. But in addition to that portion, we were able to accomplish most of the goals that we set out in our programmatic work plan. We were still able to participate in a lot of the priority projects that we identified. We'll be discussing each of these in a little bit more detail in the next few slides. And then for our performance targets, our core regulatory function, we were able to meet our goal for enrollments, so 207 general order enrollments over the last fiscal year. That was split between the regional order and the statewide general order. We conducted 14 outreach events throughout the state, and we were able to conduct 49 inspections. Those inspections were split between compliance inspections as well as some enforcement inspections. All right. So that leads us to the adoption of the statewide cannabis general order and policy. And Elizabeth's going to take it away from here again to discuss the permitting process, some of the differences between the statewide general order and the regional general order.
All right, so we talked a little bit about the process of the Water Board developing the statewide general order, but I want to talk too about some of the differences because you all are probably pretty familiar with the regional general order. The statewide general order was certainly built from some of those lessons learned and added in lessons learned from Region 1 as well as from other programs that the State Board administers. So one of the biggest changes is that water rights requirements and in-stream flows are integrated into the general order. While I am not prepared to talk about water rights issues, we certainly do see, we cooperate very closely with the Division of Water Rights. Our staff is aware of the issues that would be of highest priority to them. So if we don't happen to have a Division of Water Rights staff member with us on inspections and the permitting compliance staff sees an issue, they know what to record and the details to give to that division. We also, I mentioned the online application process, so actually we'll just go forward to the next. Oh, this is a snapshot of the portal. It's a pretty easy thing to find, and you can just enter Google search terms, water board, cannabis permit, and this pops right up to the top. And it's a pretty easy portal to enter information into. We ask for numerous addresses, which cultivators usually have on hand, such as their cultivation address, the discharger, their address, their own address, the landowner address if it's different, legally responsible party if they have someone who's different from themselves, and their APN, of course, and information related to their water withdrawal process. So a little bit of comparison between the orders. This is a pretty detailed table, so if you have further questions after I highlight a few sections, let me know. But I was going to highlight the Watercourse setbacks because that is one of the most important things that we do is protect surface and groundwater. And protecting surface water is something that is core to the cannabis program's objectives. So in the regional order, we did have a 200-foot setback for class 1 and 2 water courses. That was for both of our, for tiers 1 and 2. If they wanted to be closer to a water body, they'd need to go to tier 3 in the regional order. But as close as they could get was 100 feet. They weren't allowed to go closer than that. Because of some other region 1's, some of the issues that they needed to grandfather into the process, those setback distances were shortened somewhat. So for the statewide general order, for the 3 classes we have up here, it's 150 feet setback from class 1, 100 feet setback from class 2, and a 50-foot setback from class 3. And those setback distances apply if you'd like to be in a risk level of low or moderate. And that's the second line on the table above there.
Elizabeth, can you quickly describe class 1, 2, and 3 for the board?
Oh, absolutely. Sorry about that. So water courses that are class 1 usually flow year-round, and they have active fish populations, both finfish and other riparian inhabitants. They also have a very robust riparian habitat along the sides, along the banks of the watercourse. For class 2, those class of waterways may also have riparian habitat, but they flow usually less of the year, so 6 months-ish or more. And so these are streams that you probably see, starting when the wet weather starts, like today, for example, since we had the last couple days of rain, class 2s may start to flow with that kind of rain event, but they'll probably dry up a month or two after the wet season ends. In class 3, those are kind of, I think of them, I guess, as gullies. They flow when it's raining, and usually it's 3 months or less out of the year, and they usually do not have riparian vegetation or riparian species present. And those classes are defined, the definitions of that were taken from the forest practice rules, so these aren't brand new for the water board. So the other section that I wanted to highlight was the second to last line here that talks about slope restrictions. You'll notice for the statewide general order, it allows for a moderate risk to go up to a 50% slope, and that's true for a high risk too. It can go up to a 50% slope. The order does not allow us to enroll anyone with a higher than 50% slope. So if an individual wants to cultivate cannabis on slopes that are steeper than that, they'll have to go through our traditional WDR process. So we have had one inquiry about that so far, but no follow-through. Probably not a surprise.
Repeat that again, please.
Sure. So slopes that are as steep as 50%
Okay.
or less, we can enroll those in our general order. If it's a slope that's steeper than 50%, and this is a slope on anywhere on the property, it's not an average slope, it's not a slope just where cultivation is occurring, it's anywhere on the property. If it's steeper than 50%, they cannot enroll for coverage in the statewide general order. They have to go through our WDR process.
Which brings up another question. So there is the statewide general order, and that's not going to go away. Are we eventually, over time, going to move people into the statewide program?
That is absolutely the objective. And I'll go through some of the more jurisdictional specific data in, I think it's in another 10 slides or so. But yes, we are working to move people into the statewide order because there are some issues with stragglers who don't do that by the middle of next year.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Could you clarify which of those orders took place? Was regional first and then statewide approval?
The regional was first, that's right.
So this is not unlike East San Joaquin and Irrigated Lands, Patrick?
So the East San Joaquin, there was no state water waste discharge requirements general order issued. It was a very different process. It was a petition of our general order that went to the state board, and they issued a decision about our order. Here, we adopted a general order, and then the state board adopted a similar general order that superseded our general order.
So is the statewide general order the final word?
The statewide general order is what all growers are required to transition into by the middle of next year.
Thank you.
So here's a little information on enrollment statistics that we thought would be interesting. This constitutes the core of our work, moving people into the regulatory process. So to your question, Board Member Markham, we had more than 700 enrollees at one point in the regional general order. And we have had almost 200 terminate out of that, which is one of the options for them when their local jurisdiction remits or recants their allocation of cannabis cultivation, those rights. So we'll go into that with Calaveras County in particular in a minute. So we've had almost 200 of them bow out, and we've had about 41 of them transition to the statewide order. The Cannabis Permitting and Compliance Unit is working very hard to encourage people to make that transition as soon as possible. We don't want to have, all 59 cultivators in Yolo County, for example, do that transition on, June 20th of next year. That would be a pretty heavy workload, and it would be difficult for us to help them make that transition before the deadline. You'll notice that there's a couple of counties that are listed under both orders. Lake County in particular we'll be addressing in the next few slides. Nevada County, Calaveras County, and Yolo County. So, our permissive jurisdictions. We have cities and counties that may allow cannabis cultivation. In most cases, cities allow exclusively indoor cultivation. Counties, when they allow cultivation, generally allow something a little bit more permissive, so outdoor cultivation. We'll go over that. So, fully permissive outdoor cultivation, that is, there's no limit on size. We have Lake County and Yolo County, and this is on the western edge of the northern half of the valley. We have a minimally sized outdoor cultivation allowance in Nevada County, which another rural county and in the mountains, of course, but on the east side of the valley here. And then for indoor cultivation only, Stanislaus County has allocated those permissions within their county. I don't know why they've decided to only go indoor at this point, but it's smart, as we'll see in the next few slides, to get your feet wet first. And then indoor cultivation only is also allowed in cities throughout our region. And you will notice, to your question earlier, most of the most permissive cultivation is occurring in the Redding office responsibility area of the region, so north of Sacramento County. And so the staff in this office are pretty busy with doing inspections and things like that. Calaveras County, which we'll address in a moment, has changed its permissiveness. So if you'll move to that one, thank you. So I'm going to address in detail a couple of those jurisdictions and the way that they've handled their cannabis ordinances and how we interact with them. So Calaveras County is probably one that you'll have seen in the news the most. They legalized very early. They legalized outdoor cultivation and did not have a ton of zoning restrictions attached to that. And so you'll probably remember the land rush that happened in that area. There were some impacts that they did not anticipate probably from that. Quality of life impacts on people who lived there for a long time, impacts on the cost of land, the cost of living, and through a Board of Supervisors turnover earlier this year, they did revoke their allowances for cannabis cultivation. And as of June of this year, it was completely banned in Calaveras County. So as you can imagine, you remember Calaveras County showing up as our jurisdiction with the most enrollments. In that map, I think they continue to have over 400. And at their high point, I think they're over 500, possibly close to 600. We are now very busy processing termination notices for cultivators in Calaveras County. So because the regional order and the statewide order are a self-certification process, we wait for them to tell us that they want to terminate, rather than here that their jurisdiction has halted the legality of cultivation and terminated then. So we wait to get that notice from them, the termination notice, and then we ask for proof. So they can't just say, I'm not growing anymore, because frankly, we don't care what they're growing, we just don't want the discharges and the risk to water quality that are associated with that activity. And so rather than them saying, I'm not growing anymore, get me out of the order, we say, well, what have you done to mitigate your risk to water quality? And so we ask for photos. That's probably the most common way that we get verification that they have mitigated their site. But also staff in Rancho Cordova is very busy with doing termination inspections. So there's a few that we've identified, a few termination notices from cultivators that think, this is either a really big risk, it's very close to a water source, we need to go out and see it, or there might be something a little inconsistent about their application or some interaction we've had with them in the past that makes us think, I think we better see that in person. So due to that workload and the staff time that's involved in that process, we anticipate that the termination process for Calaveras County is going to be ongoing for at least a year. Nevada County also legalized very early, but they did it really differently. When they legalized, you'll remember that they were highlighted on the map as a county that legalized with minimal outdoor cultivation allowances. They legalized for outdoor cultivation of 1,000 square feet or less. Now there are outdoor cultivation sites that are more than an acre in some parts of our region. And so 1,000 square feet or less is pretty small. And so as a consequence of that, we have active permittees in that region, but they've been able to, the county, I should say, county staff has been able to kind of ramp up to that workload and get accustomed to what that code application looks like and be able to better understand the culture and how to better communicate with their cultivators. It's been, on the whole, while slower for the county and probably less of an economic boon to the county than it was initially to Calaveras, as a consequence of that slow ramp up, they are actually looking at expanding their regulations at this point. So we expect in the next 6 months for them to go from that 1,000 square feet to a 10,000 square feet limit. So at that point, we'll be able to enroll a broader array of tiers and risk levels of individuals in our board. So the next counties I wanted to talk about are Lake and Yolo County. These are our most active jurisdictions in the region. Lake County has more than 100 active permits. Our staff member who has that county is probably one of our busiest. We are out there about once a month. We do inspections, and inspection days usually constitute 3 or 4 visits to 3 or 4 cultivation sites that have at least 2 staff from the Cannabis Permitting Compliance Unit. Sometimes we'll have an and enforcement unit staff. When we can, we'll bring staff from the Rancho Cordova office because that allows us to, of course, do better team building, but also to build consistency within the program. We also are working there on our relationship with the county. They have been, we have a relationship with them that probably could be better at this point. But they have had a turnover in staffing at the county, and so we hope that we'll be able to reset that relationship at this point. And we do have a meeting set up with them at this point in November, I think it is. In Yolo County, we have 89 active permits. Again, this is another early adopter of cannabis cultivation, but they have limited enrollment in their program at 70. We have more than 70 permits under the Water Board because there's a couple cultivators who just wanted the Water Board permit in the case that Yolo County legalized it in the near future. And after working with Yolo County and asking them, you know, hey, is this something that's okay with you? Is this going to happen? They said, well, we don't think it's going to happen, but if they want to pay for the permit, that's fine. So that's why we have more than they have legalized. Their county is really unique because they have their cannabis compliance, the cannabis team, housed, at least they had until very recently, it was housed in their agricultural code compliance shop. And Yolo County, I'm sure you are all aware that it's a very heavy agricultural county. It's very active. It has a history of agriculture of different types. And so they're very accustomed to agricultural product and working with growers. And so the fact that they house their cannabis program in their agricultural code section really, I think, has helped them to approach it in a way that county staff can integrate into their workload more easily. And I think to some degree it helps the cultivators to feel like they're maybe a little bit more part of the program in Yolo County. So those close relationships that the county has with the cultivators have allowed us also to have a more robust relationship with our cultivators as well.
Could you expand a little bit on the connection with irrigated lands then, or maybe you'll discuss that at the end?
We don't have plans to discuss that, actually. Early on, it's my understanding, and Griffin should probably come in here, that it wasn't something the Irrigated Lands program enrollees were interested in. So it's very similar, though.
Yeah, we have fielded quite a few questions and quite a few concerns from some of the coalitions. That issue did come up fairly heatedly in Lake County. The traditional coalition members were very concerned about the potential impacts from the county legalization and the licensing on their monitoring requirements and the ability to be able to trace any contamination back to cultivation sites versus the traditional agriculture sites in the coalition program. But as we move forward, as the cultivation trend continues possibly down into the valley, into more traditional ag lands, absolutely there's a lot of similarities between the programs, and it is something that we continue to discuss, especially with State Board now that the statewide general order is passed, looking into the future of potentially setting up regulations similar to the Irrigated Lands program. Okay, so some of the other, I'll be discussing some of the other priority projects that we worked on over the last fiscal year. One of the most exciting projects we're involved with is a partnership with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And it's something I spoke about last year as well, but it's the Anatomist Fisheries Restoration Program study within the Deer Creek Watershed. Deer Creek Watershed is on the east side of I-5, a little bit south of Red Bluff, over in that side of the drainage. The program allocated grant funding to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to perform this multi-year study. And the study is aiming to look at impacts from illegal cultivation sites on federal lands and looking at those in-stream impacts from those cultivation sites. And so the map that I have up here, it's a little bit blurry, but outlines the red dots are monitoring locations that are consistent through multiple years of monitoring. And then all of the other colored dots are corresponding to previous or somewhat current illegal cultivation sites. And so there was a lot of work up front on this project with law enforcement, identifying areas where it was safe for staff, identifying historic cultivation sites to try and set up control sampling locations versus sampling locations within impacted watercourses. And so the CDFW is the lead on the project. However, we were invited very early on to participate, which we have done. So the water boards have donated a significant amount of staff resources and time to assist with the field parameters and the field sample collection, as well as analyzing that data coming back, especially the water quality and water chemistry data, so that we could have input onto what we believe or what we see are impacts from the cultivation sites versus background conditions. And so it has been ongoing since 2016. This last spring wrapped up the final field sample collection. And this winter, we're going to be working on the final report once we get the results from the sample collection back. But in the interim, we have provided an update report to the grant managers, and we have been able to draw at least some correlations between downstream sample locations from cultivation sites versus the control sites above cultivation. And there are certain water chemistry and water quality impacts. However, currently the data set is fairly small, so it's hard to draw some large-scale conclusions from them. Our enforcement efforts have been ongoing throughout the inception of the program. This last fiscal year, we were able to participate in an effort that was a little bit different, a little bit out of the normal style of our coordination with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And it was dubbed Operation Terminus. It was something held together by the Calaveras County Sheriff's Office as well as the California National Guard. And it was really kind of a pilot project from a county's level perspective on trying to get a large-scale enforcement effort, trying to pull as many possible resources together for that enforcement effort, and trying to have a large impact in a short amount of time. And so the goal of this was to look at illegal cultivation sites in Calaveras County and try to do some sort of prioritization and assessment with all the agencies involved. And so between the water boards, our staff, and the Department of Fish and Wildlife, we were able to help identify sites that did have what appeared to be egregious water quality impacts, large-scale grading, crossing construction, potential use of chemicals, and we were able to incorporate that prioritization in with some of the law enforcement agencies. And so ultimately it was a very successful operation. We inspected 18 sites over the span of a week, and our staff are continuing to follow through administratively on those sites and making sure that they're getting cleaned up and buttoned up before this next rainy period. We did learn quite a bit out of this operation. It was definitely a little bit out of our normal wheelhouse. It was very fast-paced. There were a lot of agencies involved, so it took a substantial amount of coordination. And we were just very heavily integrated into various law enforcement agencies that we had not worked with before. So we did learn quite a bit coming out of it. We definitely have a better understanding for how these events are organized, how they're put together, and better understanding for what some of the other agencies look at when they are trying to put things like this together. So it did garner quite a bit of local media attention. You can see Clint and Yvonne in the background of this photo. So they did have, that was part of the outcome of the operation. The Sheriff's Office was very interested in a public press release so they could get the information out there that the resource agencies as well as the law enforcement agencies did come together and plan this operation and conduct these inspections. And a large part of that was driven by the environmental impacts. And then some more local media attention. One of the new projects that popped up throughout the fiscal year that was not originally identified in our work plan was priority watershed identification. And it had been something we had been doing on a smaller scale between our program and the Department of Fish and Wildlife. However, with the statewide expansion over the last fiscal year, we really tried to do it on a larger coordinated scale. And so the watershed prioritization thought process is working between us, the Division of Water Rights at State Board, the Office of Enforcement of State Board, and Department of Fish and Wildlife at the state level. And between those groups, trying to identify key areas throughout the state where there is a lot of overlapping concerns. So from the regional board's perspective, concerns about water quality issues, from the Division of Water Rights, concerns about potential illegal diversions or overuse of those water resources, and then Department of Fish and Wildlife, potential sensitive habitats, threatened and endangered species habitats, and species of special concern. And so we were able to complete that process early in the fiscal year, ultimately identifying 3 major watersheds within the Central Valley region. One of them within the Lake County, Cache Creek watershed, the Yuba River watershed, and Butte Creek watershed in Butte County. And so one of the other outcomes of this effort was the development of this online tool the state board developed. And so it does allow a user on an open interface to go in, look at a map, click on the outline of the priority watershed, and then listing all the reasons why it's a priority watershed. So things like 303D listings, known impairments, threatened and endangered species habitats, water rights issues. And so it is a very transparent process, how we are prioritizing our efforts and how we're working with the other divisions and other state agencies to get a kind of holistic approach to the environmental impacts.
So this is not focused just on cannabis, but just in general, is that correct?
It is focused on cannabis between the offices, but it takes into account a lot of the other issues in that watershed. The thought being if there's already impairments, a substantial amount of cannabis cultivation or concentration of cannabis cultivation could exacerbate those existing impairments. The cannabis identification and prioritization system, which has been gaining a lot of attention lately, has been a major focus of our efforts over this last fiscal year as well. With the statewide expansion and the BCP that we got that allocated our staffing positions, we also received funding for the cannabis identification and prioritization system. And so from previous talks, we've gone over a little bit of the system, but as a refresher, it is a GIS-based mapping tool that we partnered with some local contractors as a pilot project early in the program. The basic, most useful features of the tool is the ability to remotely identify sites through aerial imagery analysis, and then coupled with that, the ability to perform modeling to try and come up with some sort of qualitative assessment of how much risk those cultivation sites pose to water quality. And so that is the very basic definition of the tool. What we're looking at now throughout this fiscal year and the next 2 fiscal years down the road is we have received approximately $2.25 million in additional funding through the budget. This fiscal year we are concentrating on getting mapping completed statewide, which is really exciting for the programs. It's the first comprehensive large-scale mapping effort to try and identify cultivation sites on the statewide level. Part of that process is prioritizing what areas get mapped first, what types of areas get mapped. We didn't have enough funding to map every single acre of the state, so we had to preclude some areas to make sure that we are capturing data in those most sensitive dams and most sensitive watersheds.
So when you talk about mapping growth sites, are these only legal sites? Do you include illegal sites? Do you include sites on federal land?
It includes all sites on private lands. We are excluding federal lands. The reason being is we don't typically get involved with grows on federal lands. Those investigations are purely law enforcement matters, and they are often associated with cartels and drug trafficking organizations. We have assisted some of the federal agencies with trying to determine levels of impacts afterwards, or some potential sampling and remediation activities that could be done on federal lands. But
Do we see impacts to surface waters that from federal lands? And if so, how do we address those issues?
we do see those impacts, and that is one of the reasons for our participation in that AFRP, that Anatomist Fishery Study. Those are grows on federal lands that are discharging into waters that drain down into the valley. And so really where we're at the moment is trying to get a handle on at least the private land grows that we can regulate, that we can conduct our internal administrative enforcement actions against. And then at some point, if there is some sort of comfort level with staff safety or some of those issues, absolutely assisting with federal agencies. I think one of the biggest roles we could play is assisting with remediation techniques, or depending on the funding that we have still coming for the SIPS program, potentially utilizing some of our mapping abilities to help federal agencies identify those environmentally damaging sites.
So could you expand a little bit more on the maps? Are you using water resources based maps and then putting SIPs puts more layers in? Is that how it works?
We're basing it on aerial imagery. So the automated portion of the mapping is a computer program that analyzes aerial imagery. It has certain assumptions on the characteristics of a cultivation site. So things like area of disturbance, little green pixels on barren landscape. So it has those assumptions built in for the mapping software. And then in addition to the maps that it produces, it is a GIS-based platform. So we can pull in any sort of information that is a GIS-based information source. So we do look at things like areas, evapotranspiration rates as part of the model. We look at slopes, soil stability, precipitation regimes. So a lot of that information is available in the model and gets considered when we're trying to rank sites from low to high risk.
So you ask the question and then the model helps find the locations that are candidates?
Yeah, the mapping is a separate process. So once the mapping is complete and we have the data in the system, that's when we can start asking questions of the model to help us prioritize, sensitive areas and areas where we should really prioritize our efforts.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving, so throughout this fiscal year, we are getting approximately 39 million acres mapped within the state. These subregions represent the order of mapping to be completed. And so Region 1, the North Coast region, as well as our region, previously had some mapping done as part of the pilot program in the northern portion. And so we wanted to let the other regions get some data to start working with a little bit ahead of the curve so they can start conducting enrollment enforcement or prioritizing where they're going to focus their efforts. And so it's anticipated that the southern portion of the state mapping is happening right now. The deliverables are throughout the winter period. And then by the spring, it's anticipated that the mapping of the entire state will be completed. So if there's any more questions on what we've been doing this last fiscal year, we're going to start discussing what we're going to be working on this current fiscal year.
Just add real quick to a couple of points that were made earlier with regard to allocation, staff allocations in the various offices. I think quite frankly, once this new set of data comes online, identifying all the sites statewide with some exceptions, as Griffin noted, that'll be a really useful tool, not just for us, but for Fish and Wildlife, CFA, and other agencies to better understand sort of the problem of the situation that we're facing, the size of it, but also we'll be able to rely on that information to make better decisions with regard to personnel allocation in various offices. So right now, it's all a guess. You talk to folks, you see how many sites are out there. Everyone responds in a similar way, tens of thousands. This will be the first concrete evidence of cannabis cultivation throughout the state and where it exists. Is it in one county or another? Higher concentrations in certain elevations or another? All those questions that we've had. I think as a result of that, we'll be able to take another look at the distribution of cannabis staff within our region and potentially even statewide to say, does it still make sense to have staff where we do? Or do we need to adjust?
It's important you get that information, but are there any plans to continually update that? Because it would seem to me that information, point in time, that information changes significantly over time.
Yeah, actually, Region 1, now the North Coast Water Board is playing around with some tools that would allow us to update that information on a regular basis. the idea here is that while that technology hasn't been perfected yet, we still need the information, and the other agencies need the information as well. So let's get that online, and then as the technology comes to fruition, we can incorporate that.
Thank you.
Yes, Griffin, I'm curious to know in the counties that are not participating, how are they involved in this program? How are you working with them, or are you? Because the same issues do apply whether they're participating or not.
Yes, absolutely, and they absolutely are on our radar, and we do work with them. In the absence of the ability to enroll sites in those counties under the general order, most of our interaction in those counties is related to enforcement inspections. However, we do continue to do outreach even in banned counties, really reiterating that if you're cultivating illegally, if you would just follow through with some of these BMP requirements, or at least ensure that environmental damage is not occurring, then that really takes a lot of the pressure off of our program to continue to do enforcement operations. However, if there is egregious environmental damages, that's really our only route of regulation in those counties where it is illegal. But we still do our education and outreach events. We still discuss the policies and the general order requirements. And we are just now that we have staff in the Rancho office, we are starting to interact with those counties and the municipalities as some of them are beginning to go down the steps and the processes of adopting allowable ordinances. And so we do try to be a part of that process as early as possible so that we can at least have an understanding or an expectation of any large-scale permitting or workload that's going to be coming our way.
We got quite a ways to go here, so let's keep going.
So this fiscal year, these are the items that we're going to be discussing over the last portion of this presentation. Elizabeth is going to take over and discuss the implementation of the enrollment and outreach strategy that the permitting compliance group has been working on.
Hello. So the outreach and enrollment enforcement strategy is something we developed last fiscal year. I know that it was something that Clint and Griffin had been thinking about for a long time and really just hadn't been able to get to until they had more staff. So we're really excited to develop that. We developed it in cooperation with the Office of Enforcement and Division of Water Rights. And it is the first of its kind in the water boards, especially for the cannabis program, but also really in looking at how we enforce enrollment in the program. It follows on quite a number of years of experience, obviously in Region 5, but also lessons learned from other regions. Previously, though, however, the enrollment enforcement effort was less formalized, and of course there were fewer jurisdictions to enforce enrollment in. So let's see here. I wanted to emphasize that the intent, of course, includes educating enrollees regarding order compliance and getting people enrolled who are cultivating. But one of the most exciting parts of this is the metrics. This is something that at this point is an internal measurement of our success, so or otherwise, of course. So looking at the effort we put into particular elements of the enrollment enforcement strategy and what we get out of it. So I'll walk you through some of those in the next few slides. First, though, I just want to touch on outreach. Our goal for the entire region, so all of Region 5, is 18 outreach efforts, and that can include anything from a traditional presentation, like what we're doing here, to a workshop where we bring computers to the jurisdiction and cultivators actually actively enroll on site. That way they can ask us questions. In some cases, because a lot of our cultivators are located in rural parts of California, they continue to not have internet access, which of course is a whole other issue of its own. But we want to facilitate our cultivators getting enrolled as easily as possible. And because the online portal is the only option, it behooves us to make that easy for them when we can get out to them. So, enrollment enforcement. This really is the core of our workload and a really important part of making sure the program works from a financial standpoint on our side, but also really from a financial standpoint on the cultivator's side. You can imagine if you were growing cannabis or really anything else, if you're right next to someone who's doing the same thing, but they don't have the regulatory costs associated with it, then you're not on a equal playing field. And so our effort really helps to make this now legal part of California's economy equitably applied. So, Griffin talked a little bit about the priority watershed element. In the enrollment enforcement process, we do have a little bit of a separate priority watershed identification because we're looking for a smaller size watershed at this point. But in our process right now, we're lucky because one of the priority watersheds, as Griffin mentioned, is the Yuba River watershed. That's prioritized for a number of reasons, and we'll get into those in the next few slides. So that's an important element, of course. And we prioritize on a watershed basis rather than on a jurisdictional basis because we're a water quality agency and water quality begins at the watershed level. So another important part of that though, of course, if we're enrolling people in a legal program, they have to have the ability to enroll in that on a local level too. So we're looking for permissive jurisdictions. And that sweet spot, of course, is right there in the middle where those two overlap. So the enrollment enforcement process, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this just because it's very possible you may see some people who have been through this process. And I want to make sure that you have an understanding of the process that they have been through and the effort staff has put into that. So it begins, of course, with watershed prioritization there at the top. We have done that already. We did that in July of this year. And then enrollment enforcement begins. Once we've identified our priority sub-watershed, I should say, so rather than looking at the entire Yuba River watershed, which could include many thousands of cultivation sites, that would take staff years, I would say, to follow up on, we identify sub-watersheds. Usually HUC 12s, Hydrologic Unit Code, is a term developed by the U.S. Geologic Survey that identifies watersheds on a size basis and the stream level order in which they contribute to larger water bodies. So HUC 12s, again, Hydrologic Unit Code, are usually about between 20 and 40,000 acres in size, and so that enables us to really hone down on cultivation sites and identify anywhere between probably 100 to 300 cultivation sites. So we need to, after we identify cultivation sites, and we do that through aerial imagery, right now we're using Google Earth, but we look forward to using SIPs in the future. So using aerial imagery, we identify cultivation sites and then match those up with the appropriate APNs. So we can identify properties and then grab addresses for those properties. After we have that address list, we send them a first notice. And this is probably something you've seen before. I don't think it's too scary, although it is from a regulatory agency, but it's a 2-page letter that says, hey, we see from Google Earth, from aerial imagery, we think you're cultivating cannabis. Do you know that this general order is in place? And it's legal in California now, you need to enroll in this order. We give them 30 days to enroll or to contact us or to tell us that it's not cannabis, it's an orchard. We work with people in the information that they give to us and in the timelines that they need to comply. We're just asking for them to get back in touch with us though, so that we make sure that we have the right contact information and we know who to follow up with if we have continued questions. So in the follow-up procedures, we sometimes will be processing new applications. We also get returned mail. We expected that to be a bigger portion of our first tranche of letters, which was not actually as big as we expected. So that may or may not be a bigger workload. The returned mail will do our best to find secondary addresses for those individuals and follow up with them. We may have unresponsive cultivators, and this is the really important part. So that first set of respondents, that's great. We know that they want to cooperate with us, they want to be legal, they want to participate. With people who haven't gotten in touch with us, remember, all we're asking is for them to enroll or get in touch with us. We send them a second notice, and that second notice is a notice of violation. From that notice of violation, we hope that we'll get some enrollments as a result of that. It's very possible, in fact, we do expect that we will not see everyone who gets that second notice enroll. And so at that point, we'll identify those sites and analyze their risk to water quality, the size of their cultivation, maybe even talk with the jurisdiction about what priority they have in that area for enforcement, and we may follow up with much more formal process of enforcement at that point. So now we get to metrics. So our metrics are made up of values, goals, and then the actual measurement element of the metric. The values we took from a variety of sources in California resource management. Some of them came from Bulletin 160, the California Water Plan. A couple of them came from the Water Board's own mission statements for the Regional Water Board and for the statewide. And then we took one of them from the California Water Action Plan. And the reason that we did that with our values is to look at what our place is in the whole scheme of California water management and to better integrate our program with those other value sets. Goals are a more detailed definition of the value statement, and it is what we hope to get from each value. And then the metrics, of course, are individual ways of measuring our success of meeting those goals and thus living our values. So each of these, and I noticed the values are in navy blue, the goals are in light blue, and then the metrics are in green. Each goal has more than one metric, but there were too many to fit on the slide, and again, they're sort of internal. We're working with them right now. But I wanted to give you an example of how many metrics can be associated with a goal. And so in this last bullet here, we have 5 metrics associated with the goal of protecting priority watersheds and the value of preserving water resources. So we'll go a little bit more into that one in particular. So our goal, protecting priority watersheds. I mentioned to you that we were looking at the Yuba River watershed. This is a photo of the South Fork of the Yuba River. It is a gorgeous river. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's great fishing and swimming and kayaking. It's beautiful. It's a drinking water source. It feeds California's agriculture up and down the valley. It's a really important river to the state of California. And so it was pretty easy for us to prioritize this watershed because it overlaps with Nevada County. So this is a map of the watershed in light blue over the underlay of the counties in green. And you'll notice that a pretty good portion, probably about half of it, overlaps the county. The lower South Yuba River is made up of the blue and red highlighted watersheds, and then our priority watershed, the Stony Creek watershed, is highlighted in red there. So our first tranche of enrollment enforcement letters to AHUC 12 did go to that Stony Creek watershed. So when we sent the letter out on August 22nd, so just last month, this is what that watershed looked like. Those sites identified with a light blue dot are the sites that have been permitted. They either have a regional general order permit or a statewide general order permit. The ones in red are the properties that we identified that needed to enroll, that we saw as needing to enroll. Again, this is based on aerial imagery. We expect that we probably have made some mistakes in some cases. So our measurement of that in enrollment numbers, we had in that watershed 2 in the general order, regional general order, 2 in the statewide general order, and 91 individuals received a letter. So after receiving that first letter, again, that's the first notice that says, hey, we see that you're growing. We had some pretty good success. We actually did much better than we thought in our number of respondents. You'll see we got more than 50% response rate. Our goal for our measurement was 50%, so we did pretty well on that front. That was aided in an outreach event, a very successful outreach event that one of our cannabis permitting compliance staff participated in a few weeks ago. So when people called us and said, hey, what is this scary letter? We could say, hey, if you are growing cannabis, you are welcome to come to this outreach event. We'll have computers there for you to sign up. You'll be able to learn more about the order. It was really good timing. You'll notice that we got only one new enrollee as of today, or as of 2 days ago. That is based on the fact that we counted this based on them paying. So we had more apply, but only one new enrollee in that watershed had paid by the time I developed this map, or excuse me, my staff developed this map. We had 17 return mail and were able to find 16 new addresses for those individuals, so they'll be on a slightly different timetable, but they'll be going through that same process. And we sent out 24 NOVs 2 days ago. So again, we hope we get at least 25% response rate on those, but we'll see. And so from a mapping standpoint, it looks like this. One of the things I want to highlight is that we got, so you'll see that we have new applications. As I mentioned, they may not actually have NOAs yet. They may not be actually in the program yet because they haven't paid. But we have gotten a number of new applications. But also outside the watershed, so right here, there's a little yellow square behind those blue dots. And then down here, we got kind of a halo effect. So our staff member, who's the coordinator for Nevada County, stated that immediately following the mailing of that first set of letters, he got another, I think it was four or six new applications. Only one of them was from the watershed that we targeted. So obviously the word is getting around, and that's one of the biggest benefits of the program, of the enrollment enforcement strategy, I should say. So I mentioned that we were going to talk about the transition to the statewide general order.
Can I ask a question about signing people up on the previous slide?
Absolutely.
Why don't you take a drone out there and take a picture?
I think there's some rules and regulations related to drones and state agencies. Is that right?
There are very strict rules about that. We would have to get clearance from the FAA, and that it's a subject that is fraught with political intrigue.
I understand, but nothing beats a picture to document things.
And I think the databases that we're able to utilize and the Google Earth do a pretty darn good job. SIPs will do an even better job, so that's kind of where we've been focusing our efforts as opposed to drones, the liability and the permitting that we have to go through for drones. But it's an idea. It's an idea we continue to explore. It's in the back of our mind, but we have no plans to deploy drones. And if we did, there would be a lot of conversations with stakeholders before then.
And I'll just add, we do have a helicopter contract and we do have a civil air patrol contract, so we have other means of getting photography.
While we're doing some questions, I have a couple. This is about how to prioritize work areas or watersheds. And, you know, like I'm looking at Butte Creek, and that's got yellow-legged frogs and other species that are mentioned. I look at stuff like Cache Creek, and we're looking at boron, and we're looking at mercury, but we're not looking at species, and I'm trying to compare the sensitivity of those watersheds. They're different. And what I'm wondering, I see the importance of prioritizing high-density use areas, for one, and I also think it's important at least to do spot checking in low-density areas so people know you're in good places. And that's a sort of a different approach. And I'm sort of evaluating the decision to go with priority watersheds as the primary determinant of where to focus our attention.
Yeah, and speaking directly for Cache Creek watershed, that is one that we prioritize, partly due to the water quality concerns, but a large factor of that one was the density of cultivation sites, as well as the county. When we prioritized that, the county was taking the first steps into creating a local licensing program. And so we tried to work synergistically with the county, with our abilities to get there, to help get it off the ground within that watershed. And so absolutely concentration, land use issues, there's a lot of other factors that go into it as well.
One of the other things you might add to the description on the webpage then is nutrients, since that is a big issue at Clear Lake, and cultivation has a lot to do with nutrient contamination.
Absolutely.
So let's add that in as why. I think that would, for me, be the key reason to focus with the density and the existing sensitivity of nutrients in Clear Lake.
I certainly concur with Bob on the nutrient issue.
Thank you.
And just a reminder too, for the enrollment enforcement strategy, the Yuba River watershed is the only watershed that is one of our priority watersheds. that currently overlaps with the jurisdiction that's allowing additional enrollment. So again, we don't want to encourage enrollment in watersheds where it's not actually legal for them to be cultivating. All right, so transition to the statewide general order. We have mentioned this a few times. The statewide general order includes an assumption that the regional order will be rescinded as of July 1st, 2019. So that means, if that does happen, and that is something that we will be bringing before you in the next few months, that means that those individuals who are enrolled in the regional general order, who continue to be enrolled in the order at that time, will lose coverage immediately upon the rescission of that order. And so we are working really hard, every single outreach event we do, to transition individuals from the regional general order to the statewide order, and also to help them to terminate if that's something that they desire. However, they do have some embedded incentives as well. The water board permit is required for cultivators to maintain their state license through Cannabis. And certainly, if they do lose coverage, and we obviously have their location and their contact information, we will be following that up with enforcement if they continue to operate and haven't mitigated their site. So we do have some remediation efforts if that does occur, and I expect that it probably will for probably a few dozen individuals.
Excuse me, I'm going to interrupt again, but you know, this sort of begs the question of why do we do this at the regional level? And now we're doing the state and we're undoing ours. Was that a lot of extra work? And I think the answer I'd like to hear is we were the pilot program, really got a handle on this, and the state has modeled much of their work on the regional board work that we did in partnership with some of the other boards, and this will help all of the boards work together on this issue. So,
I think that's pretty accurate.
thank you.
That's 100% accurate. I mean, I know Griffin and Elizabeth too have been interfacing quite a bit with the state board. As that program was developed, state board incorporated a lot of the elements that we had in our general order, and its general order changed some because it does have some slightly different priorities, and wanted a uniform approach statewide. But we absolutely were one of the test case. We set the ground rules, and the state board followed.
Yeah, and basically, I was asking our staff to take some credit for that. So,
Thank you. The last thing I wanted to mention is that we are, aside from doing outreach in inspections and doing outreach regarding transitioning during our outreach events, we have sent out mailers to all of our regional enrollees to say, hey, you need to transition before this time, and we will be continuing to do that at least another 2 rounds before July 1st of next year. Thank you.
I got a question about communications. Are we using email or mail or both? I mean, the younger crowd is all email, so.
Yeah, we've been using both. So we do have the letters list associated with the program, so cultivators can sign up to receive the email updates. And so when we send out the notification letters, we also utilize that system to send out email notifications. And then the state board has developed quite a bit of social media platforms that can be utilized as well. So for the remainder of the presentation, I'll go over a few of the priority projects that we're working on outside of our core workload of permitting and enforcement cases, and then also discussing some of the challenges the program is currently dealing with and we anticipate dealing with in the near future. So one of the first projects I want to outline is our work with the National Guard. That was something that really started with Operation Terminus, that focused operation I discussed earlier. The National Guard in that case really served as the glue behind getting a boatload of agencies together to focus on a single project and a single problem. That was a huge benefit for all the agencies involved to have one entity kind of be able to, they're working behind the scenes trying to contact all the correct people, get everybody in the same room together, and ultimately coordinate that large scale event. And so in our working with them on that event, spurred a lot of discussions on potential abilities to work together, which not only assists us in our duties, but also assists the other agencies involved in the program. So one of the easiest things to look at is the deconfliction process. And so deconfliction is a term that describes looking at potential sites, either permitting sites or enforcement sites, and determining whether or not the individuals associated with those sites, the landowners, the operators, anything about the site would be putting staff in danger, or if that site or those individuals are part of an investigation from another federal or state agency that we wouldn't be impeding with. And so that's a basic health and safety item that was identified early in the program, and we have been working with the Department of Fish and Wildlife to do that process for us, to help us out utilizing their law enforcement databases and communications with other agencies. As the program has grown, especially to the statewide level, there's now a much higher workload associated with that to the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And that is one area that has hampered our ability to respond quickly a little bit. Sometimes it delays our ability to do inspections if that request takes a long time or we can't hear back immediately, or sometimes our planning efforts get pushed back a little bit. And so that was one of the immediate areas that we identified, the ability to work with the National Guard to do some of that analyst style work to help the program out, help the program understand the cultivation industry a little bit better, and then make sure that we are being safe in the areas that we're going. And so those discussions kicked off last year, and we were able to get a memorandum of understanding together with the National Guard for a use of one of their analysts, and that use is statewide for all of the regions as well as the state board. That analyst will have the ability to do that deconfliction type of analysis. There's other benefits associated with the MOU, potential aerial support. So if regions don't have standalone helicopter contracts, potentially being able to use some of the National Guard resources to do aerial reconnaissance. One of the biggest benefits, though, is that agency is really eyes and ears. They are involved with jurisdictions across the state. They do have a lot of information associated with industry trends, and they're in contact with a lot of the jurisdictions that we eventually work with. And so it's a really beneficial relationship, and having it codified in the MOU is going to greatly assist our program, make us more efficient, make us better able to respond, and then also help us with future planning efforts. So we did participate in another focus enforcement operation this summer. The operation in Calaveras was very popular, and the word made around to a lot of additional counties in the state that wanted to participate in something similar. We were invited to the table for what was called Operation Greenwave very early in the process, at the very beginning this time. It enabled us to identify those high priority sites at the very beginning. And based on our work with Calaveras County and some of the other agencies last year, those agencies already had a pretty good idea of what the water boards and what Fish and Wildlife environmental staff were concerned with, and the types of sites that we would be able to assist with the cleanup or assist with the county efforts. And so this was a larger event. It took place over 2 weeks, spanned 4 counties, 2 counties in Region 5, the Central Valley region, and then 2 counties in the North Coast region, Region 1. It was months of planning. We were holding planning meetings at least twice a month, starting in January. All said and done, there was probably over 100 personnel involved between the water boards, both the Central Valley Water Board, the North Coast Water Board, Division of Water Rights, Office of Enforcement, all of the 4 counties, sheriff's offices, district attorney's offices, National Guard, Department of Fish and Wildlife, CAL FIRE, just a really long list and a really large effort. It was a very successful effort as well. We were able to identify and inspect 27 sites over the course of a week within the Central Valley region. And that was spread over 4 days of inspection, so doing 2 to 3 inspections per day, utilizing 4 teams. It was a large effort, and we were able to complete all of those inspections, and we are being able to now follow through administratively, working with those dischargers or landowners to get the potential voluntary cleanup efforts, and then escalating others to traditional enforcement actions if they're not willing to comply. One of the other items that we developed through this process was the rapid inspection memo. And so as part of the planning, it was our goal to be able to work with the various district attorney's offices for prosecution of environmental crimes, especially those crimes that are associated with cultivation and can potentially be used for felony enhancements for litigation. And so one of the drawbacks to identifying the environmental crimes is it can be a little bit time consuming to complete the full inspection reports, to really get all the documentation together for each of those sites and get that information to the district attorney's office or to the sheriff's office for their charges. And so what we worked on throughout the spring was a very streamlined, very short inspection template that really documented the bare bones, most egregious issues associated with the site to a level of detail that the district attorneys or the sheriff's offices could use should they choose to prosecute for environmental crimes. And so it was a lot of work. As excited as I was about it, I'm sure all of the staff in the audience that were participating were not very excited. We had to do the reports at the end of each day, so they were up late, working on the reports so we could get them out the very next morning. It was a lot of work, but ultimately we were able to complete them in a timely manner and get that information to the county level so they could work through their process with it. So some of the challenges that we have faced and continue to face. For the permitting and compliance, the local legalization rates within the Central Valley region is a really large block to our permitting ability. So as you saw on the map, there's really 4 main counties, 3 now that Calaveras is overturned its allowance, that we can conduct permitting activities on those commercial scale sites. And so that is one area of the program that we do heavily focus on tracking counties that are going through the process of either adopting commercial cultivation allowance or they're at least asking those questions. We try to meet with them, discuss how our program coordinates with county level, some of the things that we've witnessed, at least with county ordinances, and how we can integrate ourselves into that overall process. But for permitting abilities, it is a large hurdle to overcome, but we do see that starting to occur. Starting with the municipalities within banned counties that are allowing for cultivation, and then eventually, I believe we will see a lot of the counties start to allow cultivation. And one of the things that we're looking at is, like Yolo County was a really good example of a local ordinance that leveraged existing resources within their ag department and the ability to get a program stood up in a short amount of time. And so if we start to see the cultivation go more down into the valley, traditional ag areas, that could be a potential benefit for statewide enrollment and licensing. The industry understanding of all of the new regulations over the past 3 years, that is a very large hurdle for the cannabis industry as a whole. That's why we're focusing so much on our outreach efforts to try and educate the cultivation community on best management practices, requirements of the regulations, and any other questions they may have about the process. And kind of trying to speed it up a little bit, the enforcement side of the program is continuing to struggle with property transactions, trying to track down and identify responsible parties, operators, and landowners. It is a continual hurdle that we deal with. Oftentimes, as soon as we get the inspection done, the property can change hands, or the responsible party is nowhere to be found, and leaves us with a struggle to identify who to go after or how to conduct that enforcement action. And then just internally, the rapid growth of the Watercourse program has been something to really come up to speed quick. All of the new staff associated with the program, all of the strict training requirements, the changes in our own regulations, as well as the statewide licensing agencies, has been a lot to overcome and a lot to become comfortable with. But ultimately, the staff in the Central Valley program have done a great job. We've been able to be very successful over the years, and all of the new staff, as soon as they came in the door, have made huge improvements and huge progress. And so it's been an exciting time, and I think I'm at least very happy with where the program's going, and looking forward to continuing that trend. And then, pending any questions, we also have Aaron Ragazzi from the Division of Water Rights that's going to be discussing some of the water rights components and policy aspects of the new regulations, as well as Yvonne West from the Office of Enforcement that will be discussing items that her office is working on.
Are there any questions? Excuse me. Are there any questions?
I've got one. What percentage of the growers do we currently have enrolled? What's the best guess right now?
Best guess, maybe 10%.
Long ways to go.
Yeah.
Any further questions or comments? Thank you very much. We're going to take a 5-minute break. Be back in here. Be back in here in about 5 minutes, please.